So essentially, my talk today focuses on the recent translation of this short novel, Guerre, War, one of several recently rediscovered manuscripts by the highly regarded but controversial 20th century novelist Louis-Ferdinand Céline. And the paper is in 4 parts. First, I'll discuss how these manuscripts came to light and their relevance to Céline's overall corpus. Secondly, the heated aesthetic and moral debates surrounding Céline's works, including his translations, so I'll say some specific things about the translations too. Third, the unique linguistic challenges he poses to his translators, not least his use of what we might call substandard or colloquial French or argot, okay, or slang. And I'll conclude by briefly mentioning some important cultural and literary resonances from Guerre, which I think further vindicate the addition of this short novel to his corpus. Okay. Now, for those some of you probably do know who Céline is, some of you maybe don't, so I'll just give a bit of background as to his importance and legacy. He's regarded by many as the most important 20th century French novelist alongside Proust, or possibly behind Proust, depending on one's point of view. He is celebrated for the innovative oral style of his written prose and his unflinchingly honest first-person narrative voice, marked by a coruscating black humour. His powerful, visceral depictions of war and social oppression are unlike anything else in modern or contemporary writing. Now, his debut novel, the famous Voyage au bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night, published in 1932, catapulted him to literally overnight international fame. Only a few years later, however, between 37 and 41, he irrevocably damaged his reputation by publishing 3 anti-Semitic pamphlets. As a Nazi sympathizer, he was forced to flee to Denmark via Germany in 44, eventually being pardoned by the French government in 51, and achieving partial rehabilitation with the publication of 3 novels known as the German trilogy, D'un Château l'Autre, Castle to Castle, Nord, North, and Rigaudon, between 57 and the year of his death in 61. Yet, understandably, Céline has never fully shaken off the stigma of his anti-Semitism and fascist associations. In 2017, his dark side came under renewed scrutiny when Gallimard controversially announced plans to reissue the pamphlets, before eventually backtracking. Now, while this is entirely understandable, the outrage risked completely overshadowing Céline's colossal achievements as a writer of fiction. And his place in French literary history again rose to the fore in August 21, when Le Monde revealed that chest containing 6,000 unpublished pages of Céline's manuscripts had been discovered. And you have to sort of imagine the reaction to this. It's the equivalent of another great writer like Joyce or Virginia Woolf, or suddenly discovering, 6,000 pages worth of undiscovered manuscripts. The news was unexpected, and the pages included an unedited version of the novel Casse-Pipe, a medieval legend, La Volonté du Roi Crogold, an early draft of his second 1936 novel, Mort à Crédit, a short untitled novel, the one that has now been published as Guerre, and a 3-part novel entitled L'Ombre. So the story behind these manuscripts is like something out of a detective novel. They were handed to Céline's executors by the former Libération journalist, and Libération is a left-wing publication, Jean-Pierre Thibaudat, in March 2020. In his book, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, Le Trésor Retrouvé, published in 22, Thibaudat gives his side of the story, one that is mired in the chaos of post-liberation Paris. His involvement stretches back to April 1982, when he met Caroline Lanciane Moranda, daughter of Yvan Moranda, a prominent left-wing resistant who had fought with de Gaulle's Free French forces. Now, Moranda had moved into Céline's Montmartre flat at 4 Rue Girardon, shortly after the author fled Paris for Germany in 1944. And Thibaudat claims that Moranda took possession of the manuscripts and not, as many Céline scholars claimed, one Oscar Rossembly, a Corsican collaborator turned resistant. And seemingly, Moranda's daughter accidentally stumbled upon the box of manuscripts years later, probably sometime in the early 80s, in her basement, and felt that Thibaudat, with his left-leaning literary credentials, could be entrusted with their safekeeping. And they agreed that he would not hand them over to Céline's widow, Lucette de Touche, for fear that she would withhold, edit, or hide certain portions of the manuscripts as a way of managing her late husband's legacy. And Thibaudat then promised to wait until Lucette's death before making the discovery public. Small problem is he had to wait until November 2019 when Lucette finally died at the age of 107, 58 years after Céline's death, so clearly nobody anticipated this. The discovery was revealed to the wider public by Le Monde on August 5th, 21. That's Céline as a young man in 1914, just before he went off to war. And these are the manuscripts. Now you'll notice the pegs. You're thinking, why are there pegs there? Céline had some idiosyncratic habits, one of which was to, he wrote multiple drafts of his manuscripts, and one of them was to actually hang each draft on the washing line inside his house. Anyway, whatever works, I suppose. And now, Céline's executors, François Gibault and Véronique Chauvin, argued that they had illegally and needlessly been deprived of this treasure trove for decades and took legal action against Thibaudat. And Thibaudat, having honoured the donor's wishes and spent countless hours deciphering the manuscripts, felt equally miffed at being cut out of the picture and denied a say in how these manuscripts would be disseminated. He wanted them to be donated to reputable public archives like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris or IMEC in Normandy. Gibault and Chauvin disagreed and won out, although since then they've reached a kind of compromise where the manuscript of Morat Crédit has been given to the Bibliothèque Nationale. And with the fervent backing of Céline scholars, including Pascal Fouché and Henri Godard, they authorised Gallimard to publish the untitled novel as Guerre, alone with Londres in 2022, followed by La Volonté du Roi Cobalt in April 23. All of the newly discovered books were published in May 2023 in a 2-volume appendix to Gallimard's Pléiade edition of Céline's complete works. So for those of you who don't know, the Pléiade is the kind of canonical, sacred rubber stamp of literature of a high caliber. So that's the kind of fascinating, albeit convoluted story behind the manuscripts. Now, given Céline's international reputation as a great writer, despite the controversial aspect, and the excitement generated by their discovery, it's hardly surprising that there was a rush to translate these manuscripts, to acquire the rights first, but then to translate them. And the most obvious candidate for the first translation was Guerre, the first manuscript to be published by Gallimard, and which also happens to be quite short, so translators were able to turn it around quite quickly. And I've counted around 20 translations, there may be more, into 20 languages, ranging from English to Creole, and I'm honoured that she should be online, I think, that Guerre's Croatian translator, Maja Vukošić-Zurica, if I pronounce her name correctly, is at this talk, so it might be interesting to hear what Maja's experiences of translating Céline into Croatian have been. So just to give you a brief plot summary of Guerre, for those of you who haven't read it. It's narrated by the first-person narrator Ferdinand, who's an obvious reminder of Ferdinand Barthélemy, Céline's memorable anti-hero and semi-autobiographical alter ego in Voyage au bout de la nuit. And also a precursor to his narrator Ferdinand in his second novel, Morat Crédit. And bear in mind, those of you who don't know Céline, pretty much all his novels were semi-autobiographical in nature. So Céline fought in the First World War, was badly injured in the First World War, like his characters, okay, his first-person narrator. And there seems to be a significant section missing at the beginning of Guerre, because the manuscript begins at chapter 10, so it's assumed that chapters 1 to 9 are missing, and that they probably contain the story of Ferdinand and his comrades, whose ghosts appear early on in Guerre. Their regiment is led by Le Drelière, and it was seen that they attempted to desert and run off with the regiment's funds. Guerre goes on to chart the traumatic aftermath of Bardamu's war injuries, his sexually active convalescence with a hospital nurse, Mademoiselle Lespinasse, and his infatuation with Angèle, a fickle prostitute and widow of the pimp Cascade, for whose death she is responsible. When she lands herself an English protector, the married middle-aged Major Cecil B. Purcell, Angèle and Ferdinand immediately seize the opportunity to join him in London. Now, in Londres, the novel which I'm not really talking about, albeit briefly, the story continues. Angèle becomes a kept woman, enjoying the plush surroundings of Purcell's luxurious Maida Vale mansion. So Londres is the follow-on novel, okay, chronologically and sequentially from Guerre. Now, anyone wishing to take on the daunting linguistic challenge of translating Céline's manuscript needs to be mindful of two aesthetic and ethical considerations. The first pertains to the aesthetic value of the manuscripts, and the second to the problematic moral and political stance of their author, clearly. Now, some Céline scholars have cast doubt on the aesthetic worth of the text on the grounds that they are unfinished and incomplete. How should we measure their literary value? Should we read an early draft of a Céline novel in the same way as the better-known books published during his lifetime? Did Gallimard unfairly rush to capitalise on the excitement of the manuscript discovery by publishing Guerre and Londres standalone novels? And don't forget, there was maybe a financial incentive here too. Céline was a notoriously meticulous writer who endlessly pored over successive drafts before he was ready to publish. And his original publisher and editor, the Belgian Robert de Noël, was no less uncompromising when it came to excising passages he considered too racy. This is precisely what he did with Mort à Crédit, which led to a rare falling out between the two men. How a version of Guerre or Londres seen through to publication by its author would have looked is open to conjecture, nor can we even be certain that Céline who would have wanted to finish the book. I mean, one thing that most people are agreed on is, had she gone on to publish Guerre and Londres, as you'll see, there are some quite shocking, explicit passages which are more explicit than the finished novels, okay? So just a sort of government health warning. But so it's likely that Céline would have done a degree of self-editing and that his own editor and publisher de Noël would have possibly prevented him from including certain passages. And there are some scholars, just to briefly mention, Émile Bramy in France, Pierluigi Pellini and Giorgio Mel in Italy, who've asserted that Guerre was never intended to be a finished, discrete work. And this is on the basis that the focus of Guerre is on Ferdinand's injury and recuperation in hospital, whereas in Voyage you go straight from him fighting in the trenches to him being demobilised and back in Céline Street. So they say that provides the missing link. However, there are indications that Céline did plan to publish Guerre as a standalone novel. First, he frequently complained bitterly from 1944 onwards that his manuscripts had been stolen. Secondly, there's compelling evidence to suggest that Guerre was written in 1934, 2 years after Voyage was published. And thirdly, in the letter of July 34 to the author Eugène Dapitte, Céline envisaged Guerre and Londres as part of a chronological triptych: enfance, guerre, Londres, okay? Childhood, war, London. So the Gallimard editor of Guerre and Londres, Régis Tetamanzi, has argued, I think, plausibly, that enfance directly relates to Mort à Crédit, which is a coming-of-age novel that already existed, that was published in 1936. And that therefore it logically follows that Guerre and Londres refer respectively to Céline's war injuries and convalescence. Sorry.
Can everybody switch off their microphones, please, because we can hear someone speak. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So now, just to say that he probably envisaged this as part of a triptych. Okay. Now, if some familiarity with these recent debates about the literary status of the manuscripts is obviously of benefit to any translator of Céline, then equally pertinent, I should say, and perhaps even more contentious, is the long-standing dispute about his questionable moral stance. Specifically, whether it is still appropriate to translate an author whose views are so reprehensible and offensive. Even allowing for his literary talent, are we justified, especially in today's morally sensitive climate, in separating Céline's works from the man? Now, I've argued in my biography, following esteemed Céline scholar Henri Gaudard and others, that this separation is morally legitimate on the basis that Céline's anti-Semitic views, while clearly abhorrent and inexcusable, are contained exclusively in the pamphlets and not in his novels. Okay, so a clear demarcation has been made. And this distinction is important because it allows us to judge the novels separately on their own merits as literary rather than political texts. And in fact, this was the view that was held, for example, by Philip Roth, the American Jewish novelist who was a great admirer of Céline's fiction, was understandably appalled by the anti-Semitism of his pamphlets. And it's also the opinion to which his recent American translator, Charlotte Mandel, subscribes. Now, just to, that's her translation by New Directions. There's a second English one, more of which later, by Alma Press, by Sander Berg. Okay, so there are two English translations, and I want to compare a little bit some of the approaches of each. Okay, now Mandel states in an interview, "I would never translate things that incite hatred or that are racist in any way, but I think literature is more important than politics. Guerre is a searing indictment of the horrors of war. Obviously, there's a lot of objectionable language in it, but I don't believe translators should be censors. We need to act as mediums, not so much for the author, but for the text. There are so many authors that have views that differ from us, and also horrible views. We can condemn Céline's views, obviously. We shouldn't just ignore them, but we can't not pay attention to him or not acknowledge what a great author he was." I just added, just for amusement in a way, a few weeks later, this has been commented on in non-literary publications too, The Economist, who also praises the depiction of war in Guerre, okay? But the key thing here about Mandel's position is that it's pretty unequivocal. She sees her role as translator to act as a medium for the text, not to pass judgment on the author, however awful that author may be. What is more, she defends Guerre's invaluable contribution to war literature. Now, Raphaël Confiant, who's perhaps surprisingly translated Guerre into Creole, there it is, so that's Creole for war, La Guerre, by Caraïbe Édition. Similarly defends the separation of Céline, the author, from his novels. Confiant is both an accomplished translator like Mandel and an acclaimed novelist in his own right, which confirms Céline's long-held reputation as a writer's writer. Okay, so for example, Kurt Vonnegut and Philip Roth used to give classes on Céline in the Iowa Writers' Workshop in the mid-70s. Now, Raphaël Confiant's Afro-Caribbean heritage, he is from Martinique, naturally makes him alert to Céline's racist views, but he outlines his reasons for going ahead with his translation nonetheless. First, Céline has been translated into Hebrew, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Secondly, translation forces language to leave its comfort zone. And thirdly, translating literary texts into Creole significantly enhances the cultural reputation of a language with a largely oral tradition that has still not received the global recognition it deserves. So I'll just pick out some relevant quotations here. He says, "Tous les livres de Céline sont traduits en hébreu et son célèbre Voyage au bout de la nuit a même été publié par le Gallimard israélien." So there's the English translation. and he says, la traduction oblige la langue à sortir de sa zone de confort, okay, exit its comfort zone. And he says that, that traduire oblige à exprimer des réalités complètement étrangères au monde créole. Guerre se passe dans le nord de la France, en pleine guerre, donc dans un univers que le créole doit s'efforcer de rendre au mieux. La traduction créole est en tout cas essentielle pour permettre à notre langue de devenir une langue de plein exercice. So this is the idea of the challenge of translating an experience that would be alien to Creole culture, the First World War in Northern Europe in 1914. Now, what Confiant does here, it seems to me, is he values literary translation not just as a way to increase the visibility and reputation of the source text and its author, although clearly he's doing that, but also to signal the openness of the recipients of the translated text to new external influences, in this case the war in Flanders, experiences that enrich and broaden its own culture as well as boosting its cultural self-esteem. Now, in a more politicized but analogous fashion, in the same way that translating Guerre into Creole has a significance that goes beyond the intrinsic merits of Céline or his text, so too has the translation of Voyage au bout de la nuit into Hebrew, which Confiant cites as a moral precedent, had a major intellectual and societal impact in Israel that transcends the source text and its author. And I think it's worth, for context, briefly summarizing the controversy that surrounded the translation into Hebrew. Now, Israeli academic Ilana Hammerman translated Journey, or Voyage I should say, into Hebrew in 1994, so this is some years back, which was the 100th anniversary of Céline's birth. And her translation was published by Israeli publisher Am Oved. Now, until that year, there had been, understandably, a complete boycott in Israel on Céline and his work. It's worth noting that Voyage had been translated into English in 1934 and multiple other languages in the mid to late 30s, okay? Between February and April 1994, no less than 58 articles or items broached the translation controversy in Israeli newspapers, mainly in the left-wing newspaper Haaretz, as well as 5 radio broadcasts and 5 TV shows. And a motion to boycott the translation was initiated by 2 members of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, Shaul Yahalom of the National Religious Party and Limor Livnat of the Likud, both of which are right-wing parties. But the fiercest disagreements were within the Israeli left. Representing both sides of the debate were historian and fascism expert Zeev Sternhell and philosophy professor Yesha Gahan Leibovitz. Now, Sternhill, a Holocaust survivor, argued that when it comes to protest literature and the socio-political novel, we cannot separate the work from its author's political stance. And this was the view that was reiterated in 2022 by journalist Adam Gopnik in the New York Times, who objected to Charlotte Mandel's translation of Guerre, a view which, as we've seen, she flatly refuted. Sternhill argued that the separation of man and work is particularly suspect with Céline because he was not just a fascist, but a Nazi sympathizer and supporter of racial theories. Contrary, for example, to 19th century composer Richard Wagner or to the racist politician and journalist Edouard Drummond, Céline wrote in an era when anti-Semitism was no longer just theoretical. Though strongly opposed to censorship in general, Sternhill held that there were some exceptional cases in which moral considerations must supersede aesthetic ones. Now, Leibovitz, on the other hand, countered, also of the Israeli left, countered that one should separate an author from his or her work because these are 2 completely different things. Céline's personality is irrelevant. Voyage is considered one of the most important works of the 20th century. Therefore, to translate it is the correct decision in the context of making world literature available in Hebrew. Now, as for the translator, Hammerman, who spent 2 years of her life translating Voyage and worked hard to promote it, she echoed Leibovitz in defending the modernist principle of the autonomy of the work of art and artistic judgment. In the epilogue to her translation of Voyage, She defended it primarily on the grounds that it is, and I quote, a truly great novel, interesting, moving, outrageous, and exciting, a challenge to both thought and feeling that only few modern works offer their readers. She also cited it as an example of how 20th century avant-garde art can significantly enhance our understanding of that century's unprecedented ideological and political turmoil. So in other words, the moral and intellectual argument for translating Voyage, in her view, outweighs even the aesthetic one, because it says so much about the crucial era in which it was written, allowing the reader to better understand the cultural, social, and human background of the most destructive ideologies of modern times. So clearly there she's alluding to fascism and Nazism. Now, in a later interview in 2006, Hammerman subsequently revealed another ulterior motive behind her translation. It was to try to undermine, I quote here, some cultural and ideological conventions in Israel. In other words, she was fully conscious of using Céline's novel to provoke a wider debate about what should or should not be published in her country, which tended to split an opinion along ideological lines between Zionists and post-Zionists. So, Confion's mobilization of his Céline translation for the linguistic and cultural enrichment of Creole, and Hammerman's weaponizing of her translation into Hebrew to break down political and ideological barriers to censorship in Israel, are both examples of the polemical potential of translation, especially when it comes to reputable but also controversial writers such as Céline. Now, I just want to mention a final, albeit more low-key example of the translation polemics of Guerre, its publication in German. So there it is, there's a kind of Bauhaus-ish feel to that cover. Krieg, of course, means war. Now, as we know, Germany, like Israel, is a country that is particularly sensitive to the question of anti-Semitism, albeit from the historical standpoint of the perpetrator rather than the victim. So it's hardly surprising that in his foreword to the German translation by Hinrich Schmidt-Henkel, published by Rowohlt, critic Nicholas Bender devotes several pages to condemning Céline's racism. But this unequivocal condemnation does not prevent him from maintaining the same separation between the writer and his novels as Mandel and Confion. Bender cites three moral justifications for translating Guerre, and these translations are a mixture of my rusty A-level German and Google Translate, so I've done the very thing we tell our students not to do. But anyway, it's been tweaked. So he says first, and this is understandable given Germany's militaristic past, he emphasizes the importance of Guerre as a first-hand account of the suffering of war that is deeper, more authentic and comprehensive than Voyage. So in other words, he goes into more depth about the suffering and personal experience of war even than Voyage. I quote, it is the Céline text that most comprehensively fleshes out the experience on and behind the front. Krieg, or Guerre, deepens what appears in Journey to the End of the Night only in an absurd episode and fills the gap there between injury and recovery in Parisian hospitals. Secondly, the style of Guerre, as he says, is not comparable to that of the rest of Céline's work. In fact, the text is more direct than one would expect from Céline. So it's a unique work in the sense that its style is different from Céline's other novels. And finally, he says it not only offers a good introduction to Céline's work, but also a very pleasurable read. I mean, that's a little more debatable, perhaps. But one thing is certain, German readers can now form their own opinion of the rediscovered Céline and must have the possibility of doing so. So there's the sense in which readers have the right to have this text made available to them. Now, I've addressed at some length the aesthetic and moral debates surrounding Guerre, the provisional, unfinished status of the text, and the abhorrent views of its author. I want to turn now to some of the specific linguistic challenges posed by Céline to his translators. So we'll look at some passages. And I'll begin by comparing and contrasting the approaches of his two English translators, I should say two translators into English, Sander Berg, who's published here in the UK with Armour Press, and I know him personally, you know, for full disclosure, he actually did his PhD at Birkbeck as well, as Maripap knows. And he consulted me about some context to the manuscripts and some of the translations. I mean, he's a better translator than me, but, you know, I think I was able to vaguely advise him. And he published his version with Alma Press, and Charlotte Mandel, of course, who published hers with New Directions in the States. Now, Berg strongly advocates an approach that replicates in English Céline's use of colloquial French, especially slang. And if you'll permit me, I'll read out this rather long passage because it makes sense for the extracts I'll look at, the modus operandi of Berg when he translated this. He says, "The most important choice a translator has to make is that of style and register. The worst thing one can do to a text by Céline would be to make it bland. It would be a betrayal of the original intent. It is not uncommon to see translations of Céline, including of Guerre or War, that are written in standard grammar, even if they contain many colloquial expressions and turns of phrase. It is the safest option, offering the smoothest reading experience. I have opted for a more radical approach with all the risks that this entails. Some passages are hard-hitting, but grammatically fairly standard prose. There are also some snippets of lyrical prose, more of which later, beautifully evocative and original passages, but most of the novel is written in substandard French." Now, he then goes on to explain the strategies, the translation strategies he uses to try and address this and render it in English. Céline nearly always drops the ne in negatives and the il in il fallait and il y avait, uses the relative pronoun que instead of qui, reduplicates nouns with pronouns, uses que after question words, avoir as an auxiliary verb with reflexive, so that should be être, and so on. To replicate this each time it occurs with an equivalent substandard English expression is impossible. But one way to think about translation is that it is the act of imagining what someone would have said in the same situation in a different language. Therefore, a sensible way of reproducing Céline's style is to introduce comparable substandard expressions throughout in English. Double negatives, ain't, was instead of were, cause for because, and so on. That way, the reader of the English text will have an experience that roughly parallels that of the French reading public. Now, we'll see some examples of these in a minute. However, not everyone agrees. This is just one example. There are other reviews, but just to give you a flavour of those who have stated a preference for Mandel's version over Berg's. The effect can be bewildering. Berg reaches mostly for spoken British English, even introducing Cockney rhyming slang. They seem to swallow our porky pies before falling into words and phrases more popular with American teenagers. Legit, bone, a beat your meat, most of which came into use after the author drafted his manuscript in the early 30s. Therefore, British readers may prefer Mandel's more measured translation. She's content not to look for colourful synonyms and turns of phrase, careful not to make Céline's narrative sound any more hysterical, and thereby reduce him to a comic fool. Now, there is undoubtedly a seductive quality to Mandel's sometimes smoother, more measured translation. But Berg's greater emphasis on replicating French colloquialisms in English is, in my view, and this is apart from the fact that I know him, okay, this is me being objective, truer to Céline's literary intentions and social outlook. Argot, or French slang, was for him the language of society's underdogs. And, you know, he had a strong sympathy for the underdog in his novels. I'm not talking about the pamphlets here. And this was very different from the erudite, cerebral, classical French of the cultured elite depicted in the novels of his literary predecessors, Gide and Proust. Okay, so he was situating himself in relation to them. Moreover, Céline saw this colloquial and grammatical French as a way of injecting new life into a traditional French that he saw as having become too academic and moribund. Prose should no longer just narrate, he thought, but evoke feeling, what he famously called l'émotion parlée dans le langage écrit. Okay, that's a key quote for Céline. Spoken emotion in the written word. Now, when the reviewer, Hitchcock, takes Berg to task for his use of anachronistic English slang. So, he says that Berg uses phrases that would be used by American teenagers nowadays rather than in the 30s. He completely misses the point. Céline himself was similarly criticised for including 1930s Parisian slang in Mort à Crédit in 1936, a novel that was set between 1900 and 1914. And as his publisher De Noël pertinently remarked at the time in his defence, Céline did not use slang to achieve 100% linguistic historical accuracy, but rather to reinvigorate French prose with emotion. Okay, so I think that's a key point. Now, finally, I want to consider some examples of the different approaches adopted by Berg and Mandel, especially with how they tackle this question of colloquial French. So I'll read out this first passage, which is when Ferdinand, later in the novel, he's in Flanders, in the village of Flanders, which is called Perdu sur la Lys, and observing the chaos of the bombing and the war around him. Il y avait des morts chaque jour à cause des bombardements et de la foule des troufions, mais jamais on n'avait tant débité dans les alentours. Au marché, c'était monstrueux. Les fleurs, surtout, on se les arrachait. C'est extraordinaire ce que ça fait marcher les bouquets de guerre, pour bien des raisons. On avait une sirène en cas de danger des airs, tout le monde soi-disant se planquait dans les caves. C'était magnifique à voir. J'ai vu tout un bataillon tenir à l'hyperbole, that's the name of a café, pendant 1 heure que ça a duré l'alarme. Il restait plus rien quand on est sorti, plus un verre. Ils avaient bu le cristal, j'invente pas. Un canon de 75 est monté tellement il avait peur chez le notaire avec ses cheveux au premier étage. Voilà, c'est vous dire que ça bardait. So, what Berg does here in his translation, which is the one in front of you, is he uses squaddies, British slang for a low-ranking soldier, that accurately reproduces the French troufion, which Larousse defines as a simple soldat, so that's kind of military slang. The commercial connotation of débité, as continuous selling, strikes me as appropriately rendered by doing a roaring trade. Okay, they were doing a roaring trade. And Larousse defines this as the idea of vendre un article au détail d'une manière continue, so it's continuous trade. It was Bedlam is a Cockney rendition of chaos or mayhem, which strikes me as an imaginative and more idiomatic translation of monstrueux, okay? As is, it was a sight to behold for C'était magnifique à voir. Okay, so we go back to the original. Au marché, c'était monstrueux. It was Bedlam. C'était magnifique à voir. It was a sight to behold. Now, barder, the final verb, si vous dire que ça bardait, he translates as just to say that things went berserk. And again, barder means to, when something becomes dangerous, cela devient dangereux, cela devient violent. Again, that seems like an idiomatic rendition of the original French. Now, if we turn to Mandel's version of the same passage, she provides a smooth, more literal translation, undoubtedly, and unsurprisingly more Americanisms than Cockney English. She uses troopers rather than squaddies for troufion, retains the exact equivalence of monstrous and magnificent for magnifique et monstrueux, and overlooks the commercial connotations of the verb débiter to stress instead the idea of granting passage to a large number of people or in a given time. So it's true that débiter can also be used in a different context, like cette barrière débite 500 personnes à l'heure. So it's the idea of letting large numbers of people through. But it strikes me that given the link with the market, it's more likely to be the commercial connotation that fits. So I think that Berg has been more successful overall than Mandel in capturing the colloquial tone and rhythm of Céline's source text, although her All Hell Was Breaking Loose, which is perhaps more American than British English, I think is quite a nice translation of the sense of imminent threat, okay? suggested by Saint-Bardet. Now let's turn to a second example. There's an A missing there, so it should be IA. Obviously, grammatically, there should be an il y a. So, as mentioned earlier, Céline tends to omit il, it's a deliberately ungrammatical in the French. But il y a une chose que tu sais pas dire, grande dégueulasse. This is the character Angèle, the prostitute's tirade against Cascade, her husband, okay? C'est que tu es marié 2 fois, oui, 2 fois, et avec de faux papiers, la deuxième. Il s'appelle pas Cascade, mesdames et messieurs, pas Cascade. So she's denouncing him to a crowd of people at a dinner party. Et puis il est bigame, oui, bigame, et qu'il est marié avec de faux papiers. Que sa première, elle est en main aussi, à Toulon, oui. Et qu'elle lui porte son vrai nom. Que c'est son vrai nom parfaitement. Dis-leur si c'est pas vrai à ces messieurs, dames. So, she's exposing his bigamy and also threatens to expose him as a deserter, which she eventually does. But if we look at the Mandel version here, once again she plays it quite safe, choosing to keep the colloquial English to a minimum, as compared to Berg's version, which we'll look at in a second. She translates être en main, which in the colloquial French in the world of prostitution means être avec un client, okay, or être sous l'autorité d'un souteneur, so it's the idea of being under control of a pimp, as whoring, which captures the register perfectly well. But it seems to me that Berg is a little bit more inventive when he says, for a start, he says she's hawking her mutton in Toulon. So in Green's slang dictionary, that's a sort of Cockney expression for a woman selling her body. And you'll notice that what he also does is he uses the expressions ain't, yeah instead of yes, ladies and gents instead of ladies and gentlemen. And then again, you have the kind of reproduction of the Cockney rhythm and language, and it's her what as his real name. And it's her what as his real name. So it's that's my bad rendition of Cockney. So again, he's going one step further than Mandel in really making an effort to reproduce and replicate the equivalent of Parisian slang. And it seems to me that the substitution of one urban localism for another, which also remains accessible to the reader, is entirely justified in this context. And it's worth noting that other translators have done this. So the Italian translator with Adelphi, for example, Ottavio Fatica, at times has used regional Italian dialects in places, right? So he uses the Tuscan word bischero, which means sort of idiot or stupid for con or idiot, and he's explained this in an interview. Another thing worth noting is the ellipsis, okay, the 3 dots. And this was a famous, the trois points. This was a technique deliberately deployed by Céline in his second novel, Mort à Crédit, very controversial at the time. And he was clearly already experimenting with this in 1934. And the purpose of these 3 dots was to capture speech in a more authentic way, okay? So they mark the incompleteness, the abruptness, the sudden changes in direction characteristic of everyday speech, and signify his desire to defy or move beyond the more traditional flowing prose sentence of a Proust or his predecessors. So by simulating speech in this way, also Céline sentences give the impression of being in the present, okay, so it creates a sort of immediacy which creates that emotional intensity he was seeking in his prose, okay. So I don't have time, sorry, I've already spoken a bit too long, but to compare the Berg and Mandel version. So I just want to provide a few examples from the Berg version that highlight certain additional strengths and unique features of Guerre. The first of these, already identified by some of the translations I've quoted, is his ability to capture the gritty realism of war in ways that few literary texts have managed. So I won't maybe read all of this, but I'll read half of it. C'était écœurant quand on a vu pendant des mois les convois d'hommes et de tous les uniformes défiler dans les rues comme des bandes de saucisses. kaki, réserve, horizon, vert pomme, soutenu par les roulettes qui poussent tout le hachis vers le gros pilon pour con. Ça part tout droit, ça chantonne, ça picole, ça revient en long, ça saigne, ça picole encore, ça pleurniche, ça hurle, c'est pourri déjà. And then he goes on to say, toujours quand on est con, toujours à la fête, plus quand on écrabouille, mieux les fleurs poussent, c'est mon avis. So what he's doing here is providing a powerful satire, this is the Birkbeck translation, of the needless slaughter and absurdity of war. What you have is soldiers proudly marching in their uniform who are being compared to mince being sent to the meat grinder to be sliced into sausages. And of course it's shocking, but it's also quite effective. And because what this metaphor does is it debunks the sort of heroism and initial optimism of going into war in a way that, you know, completely dehumanizes the soldiers. Nothing but meat carried on wheels to be minced by that great meat grinder of fools. They're rotting away already, then a rain shower, the wheat grows, other idiots arrive by ship. And the sort of dehumanization of the soldiers goes one step further because they're then sort of they're compared to manure, which then feeds the growth of the wheat and the flowers. So they're sort of associated with this relentless cycle of an indifferent nature, okay? So this is typical of Céline's caustic satire. Now we might be forgiven for thinking that all Céline can do is write shocking, scatological, explicit passages, but he is capable when the occasion demands of writing more poetic, understated lyrical passages. And this is one good example, okay? So this is when Ferdinand, he's finally leaving Flanders behind him on a ferry, heading to France, okay? And he's looking back behind him to the French coastline. Les deux jetées sont devenues toutes minuscules au-dessus des mousses cavaleuses, pincées contre leurs petits phares. La ville s'est ratatinée dernière. Elle a fondu dans la mer aussi. I'll just skip forward. C'était fini cette saloperie. Elle avait répandu tout son fumier de paysage, la terre de France, enfoui ses millions d'assassins purulents, ses bosquets, ses charognes, ses villes multichoses, ses fils infinis de frelons myriam merde. So you have here a kind of almost oxymoronic juxtaposition of the poetic, lyrical, understated description of the sea and the passage to England with a kind of inventive scatological neologisms, ces villes multichaux and ces frelons myriam merde. Now, Berg translates this as its multi-crapper cities, its endless swarms of myriad sharp whiz-bangs. I've included the Mandel, its multi-crap towns, that's more American perhaps, and its infinite sons of myriad ship guys. Now, I think I want to kind of link this passage also to my final point, which is that I suppose an additional testament to the value, the literary value of Guerre as a text worthy of translation is that there are also some cultural allusions to other authors and thinkers. Okay, Céline, left school early. He later trained as a doctor, but he's very conscious of his limited schooling, and he was a voracious reader and a tremendous autodidact. So he actually really absorbed multiple authors and thinkers, not just from his own period, but from earlier periods. And I want to just give quote three. One is Rabelais, the second is Proust, and the third is Freud. So two literary figures and one non-literary. Now Rabelais, as some of you may know, is the satirical Renaissance writer who also studied medicine like Céline and was something of a precursor owing to his inventive use of the vernacular to satirize authority figures and denounce war. Well, that's exactly what Céline is doing. Céline wrote an article praising Rabelais in 1957, citing him as a direct inspiration for his own re-energizing of the vernacular in 20th century literature. Okay, so Rabelais really was a sort of template in a way. And you saw those scatological neologisms in that passage. That's quite reminiscent of Rabelais, okay, which he does in his text Gargantua and Pantagruel. Now, as for Céline's immediate literary predecessor, Proust, his influence was also decisive, albeit by way of counterpoint. I mentioned earlier Céline's desire to reinvigorate French literature and extend its scope from the classical cerebral French of a Proust, with its refined lexicon, to a more emotive spoken language with shorter, punchy sentences, okay? And this linguistic rejection of Proust also finds its thematic corollary in his novel Mort à crédit. So, whereas Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu depicts the upper bourgeoisie and aristocracy of Belle Époque Paris, Céline's Mort à crédit depicts, if you like, the working and lower middle class. So he was deliberately producing a counter-narrative in that regard to À la recherche, okay? Now, in a similar way, in this passage, it seems to me, he's deliberately invoking, but sort of reversing, the Proustian notion of involuntary memory. Now, many of you may know that Proust, this passage is overquoted, but there's a famous episode, I think it's in, is it La Carnet du Porte de chez Swann? Thank you. The Madeleine episode, which volume is it? Is it À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs? Yeah. So there's a famous episode where the narrator Marcel dips his Madeleine in his tea. It's Combray, don't worry. Yeah. It's about his Aunt Leonie, anyway. He dips a Madeleine in his tea, which produces a delightful sensory experience that sort of triggers an extended daydream and a reawakening of childhood, of comforting childhood memories. Now, it seems to be that in this passage of Guerre, maybe I'll read the English to save a bit of time and go back to the French, but it's a kind of anti-Proustian involuntary memory because the past has a coercive rather than a serendipitous function, okay? It sort of ambushes him. He says, the past is a harlot, it dissolves into daydreaming and takes on little melodies on the way you never asked for. A memory takes by surprise. The past is a ripe pig, always drunk on forgetfulness, a sneaky bastard who's vomited all over your old affairs, that revolting junk you'd already put in order, stacked up, that's to say, at the end of your wheezing days. Clearly not very positive here, right? As opposed to Proust's involuntary memory, which is pleasant, serendipitous and welcome, this is coercive, unavoidable, and it can be seen really as the return of the repressed, which in this case is the war, of course, rather than the gateway to childhood innocence, okay? So we finally come on to the last bit, sorry Natalie to go over a bit, which is Freud. The psychoanalytical allusions of this anti-Proustian passage also point to Céline's considerable intellectual debt to Freud. Céline read Freud's works from the late 20s and even met the famous psychoanalyst Annie Reich in Prague in 1932. And he was certainly familiar with Beyond the Pleasure Principle, okay, published in 1920, and the psychoanalyst notions of the death drive and the sex drive. So, accordingly, violence and the libido are unleashed in Guerre and in Londres, the follow-up novel, as uncontrollable forces that cannot be restricted to the spaces that are meant to contain them, so the trenches and the brothel, the bedroom. Now, following Freud, Céline depicts Eros as the life-affirming force that seeks to assert itself over Thanatos, the death instinct. And there's just a paper-thin divide in Freud that separates these two interconnected instincts. And this similarly comes across in this passage, where Ferdinand's sexual longing for the prostitute Angèle is a compensatory instinctual reaction to his near-death experience on the battlefield. So he says, il n'avait pas menti, elle était bondatoire de naissance, so the quite explicit French there. But then he goes on to say, ça allait même d'emblée bien plus profond jusqu'au corps, pour ainsi dire, et même encore jusqu'au véritable chez lui qui n'est pas plus au fond du tout, puisqu'il est à peine séparé de la mort par 3 pelures de vie tremblante. So there's this idea of an extremely narrow separation between the death drive and the sex drive, okay? So there's the English, okay? It's only separated from death by 3 quivering slivers of life. So despite the undoubted pitfalls, challenges, aesthetic and moral dilemmas posed by Céline's Guerre, I hope to have shown in this talk why this text, even in its provisional unfinished state, is eminently worthy of translation, not only as a reminder of Céline's literary talents, but also for its contribution to war literature and early 20th century culture. Thank you.